Good morning. Good morning and welcome to the Jobs, Economic Development and Economy hearing, where we will be doing an informal hearing on a couple of different methods of review for economic development programs, which has been called by our committee the JETI Committee. I am Assemblymember Eduardo Garcia and I serve as the chair. With me this morning are a couple of my colleagues. I'll start to my left and allow the Vice Chairwoman to introduce herself and what district she represents, work our way to the right.
Sure. Welcome. I represent the 65th Assembly District in Northwest Orange County. Young Kim, thank you.
Good morning. I'm Cheryl Brown. I represent the Great Inland Empire area of San Bernardino, Colton, Fontana, Rialto, and Grand Terrace.
I am Ed Chow. I represent the 49th Assembly District. I want to thank all the presenters for being here today. Thank you.
All right. We'll let our colleague get situated and let him introduce himself after I introduce a couple of folks. Tony Simons is our chief consultant for the committee, and she's also joining us. Matthew Hurley is our committee secretary. Joaquin Pacheco is also part of the committee, and Julia King, principal consultant for the Assembly Republican Caucus. Assemblyman Mathis, introduce yourself and your district.
Morning. My district is the 26th district. It covers just about all of Tulare County, a portion of Kern County around Lake Isabella area, and all of Inyo County.
All right.
Our biggest job factors are the ag sector, public health services, and several small businesses and associations. So thank you and good morning.
Thank you, Assemblyman. The informational hearing is being convened as part of the committee's preparation for a March 15th program oversight of the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. Other components of the oversight process have included a statutory review of programs research on state and local economic development activities, and engagement with public and private stakeholders involved with the community, economic, and workforce development in California. Today's hearing is organized around two themes: evaluating methods for understanding economic development activities and assessing the state's current economic development environment. Following these opening remarks by our committee members, we will hear presentations on key features to the program and organizational oversight, including comments from California State Auditor, the Office of the Legislative Analyst, and economic development professionals whose expertise includes metrics and evaluations. The second of the presentations will be a panel of discussions on goals for economic development in California, which will include speakers from a range of economic development stakeholder organizations, including organizations that advocate on behalf of local governments, rural areas, urban areas, and business, Chamber of Commerce partners, low-income community groups, and economic development professionals. A little bit of some housekeeping. Background materials prepared by the committee staff provide a framework for today's discussion, as well as highlight some of our materials for the March 15th hearing. Copies of the committee background materials are on the table outside and can also be found on the committee's website. For those who are in the audience and wish to speak, we will have a public comment period under agenda item 4. If you wish to speak, please sign up and on the registration form and the sheet here that the sergeant has just displayed. The committee will also be accepting written public comments regarding this hearing up until Thursday, March 10th. So at this time, I'd like to ask if our Vice Chair would like to add any comments to that, and we'll also allow our other members to do the same.
I want to thank the chairman, Chairman Garcia, and our committee staff for putting together this hearing this morning. Evaluating our economic development environment, I believe, is long overdue. So I look forward to hearing from you about the best practices and methods so we can be thoughtful and thorough as possible when we review economic development entities. And I want to extend my deep appreciation to all the panelists who have come all the way to Sacramento to share your expertise and your insights. And for the members of the public who are here to speak, I thank you for your time and input that we're about to hear. So welcome.
All right. Mr. Mathis. Okay. Ms. Brown, would you like to add anything to?
At this time, I think I would like to pass. I thank everyone for being here today. I thank the committee staff, and my hat's off to both the leaders of this committee.
Thank you. Assemblymember Chow.
Well, the only thing I'd like to add is to say that I look forward to a very robust discussion on things like the performance metrics and the like, and look forward to hearing from you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Like to introduce yourself, Assemblymember, and there you go. All right. Perfect. We'll jump right in. Before we introduce our speakers, I'd like to just share the first item on the agenda is a discussion of best practices in program and organizational oversight. This item was added to our agenda in preparation for the March 15th meeting. Being as this will be the first oversight hearing for the JETI committee this season, I felt it was important to take some time to talk about doing program evaluation practices. As we will hear, there are many elements to conducting the successful program reviews. Information gained from performance reviews will also assist the committee when we are considering new legislation, as well as facilitating meaningful dialogue with the administration. We're very fortunate to have a distinguished group of presenters today. Our first speaker is Elaine Howe, and she is the California State Auditor, and I'd ask her to please come forward and begin your opening remarks.
Show my age here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. For the record, my name is Elaine Howell. I'm the California State Auditor. And what I'm going to speak about this morning is program evaluation performance audits. As I'm sure you're well aware, my office conducts performance audits on behalf of the Joint Legislative Audit Committee members of the legislature. We also conduct financial and compliance audits. But what I really wanted to talk about today is program evaluation, performance auditing, and the importance of it, and kind of the types of things that we would do if we were auditing the GoBiz, essentially, and talk a little bit about a couple of audits we've done in the past of agencies like Trade and Commerce Agency and where we found weaknesses. And hopefully some of the discussion that I provide today will inform not only the legislature and this committee, but the governor's office and the governor's administration of GoBiz and the various units within GoBiz. So program evaluation, what exactly is that? What does that do? What does performance auditing do what benefit does it provide? And it really does provide information to improve operations and to facilitate decision making, not only by the entity that's administering the various programs, but for other individuals like yourselves who are providing oversight and accountability. So it really does take a look at operations and informs decision making. It assesses, we always talk about effectiveness of a program. A program may be complying with all its statutory responsibilities, regulations, its policies, etc., but it may not necessarily be an effectively run program. So you could be complying, but are you doing as good a job as you possibly can do? And that's what a performance audit really tries to get at. It assesses how a program works, identifies perhaps any adjustments or suggestions for improvement. Also, the benefit of that type of reporting is also the transparency, engendering public confidence that this information is being shared with the public, with local businesses, with the business communities in your respective districts about how well GoBiz is functioning and serving constituents in your again, respective districts. It also informs future financial investment and resource allocation. Are we allocating our resources at the state level, at GoBiz, their various units, appropriately? Are we focusing on the right activities to really support economic development throughout California? So one of the things that we typically do when we're asked to assess an agency like this, and we've done in the past, as I said, we've audited the Trade and Commerce Agency when that agency existed years ago. And what we specifically looked at is, did they have a strategic plan? Now, it's my understanding in the background materials that staff provided that GoBiz does have a strategic plan and develops annual plans. If we were looking at that strategic plan, we would really want to understand how well has the agency and the individual units within GoBiz determined what its mission is? What is its purpose? What are those various units intended to do? What are they hoping to accomplish in performing their various functions? And are they identifying goals and objectives that tie specifically to that mission and purpose. Clearly, you need to make sure you're complying with statutory requirements, any regulatory requirements. If each of those entities, those units within GoBiz, actually have specific policies that they want to carry out to fulfill the statutory intent or the statutory requirements, do they fully understand what those goals and objectives should be? Are they clear? Oftentimes, when we have audited in the past, we've seen goals and objectives that are relatively vague, and then that trickles down to vague performance metrics. How are we going to measure whether or not we're meeting those goals and objectives? So, essential elements that we would expect to see and we would look at in a strategic plan: clearly defining the mission and purpose, understanding your statutory mandate, what your responsibilities are, and clearly laid out goals. Once you formulate your goals, then how do you develop what the outcomes should be? Establishing priorities among those goals. You may not may be able to accomplish all of the goals in 1 year, but some may be long-term goals, some may be short-term goals. Your short-term goals may allow you to accomplish your long-term goals. Once you've identified those and you're very clear, then you define targets or performance metrics that you're looking for, your desired results. We want to reach out to X number of businesses. We want to help X number of businesses gain loans. iBank is one that I looked at last night, but a variety of those different units. What exactly do you want to accomplish? And you set targets for that. Then you have to establish a mechanism to measure your results. And I'll get at data collection in a minute. And then you want to compare your results to your target and determine why, and then identify by analysis, why didn't we meet the target? Did we exceed the target? Perhaps the target was too low. If we aren't meeting the target, what do we need to do to reassess how we're carrying out our responsibilities? What are the hurdles that are getting in the way of us being able to accomplish, the entity being able to accomplish its goal and get to that end result that will benefit the California economy? And if necessary, after this analysis is done, you go back and revisit. So essentially, a strategic plan is not a document you put in place. This is my plan for the next 5 years, and I shall not review it again. You're constantly looking at it. It's a dynamic process where you're setting goals, you're setting objectives, you're setting goals, you're establishing metrics, then you're measuring against those, and then you're making adjustments. And you may need to go back and modify your plan. But one item discussed in the background materials is, what is the definition of success? And does that definition differ depending upon which of the units you're referring to? Is there an overall definition, but then there may be very specific definitions of what you expect to see, and that could change based on region. Assemblymember Brown's, the expectations in her district may be very different than a member who represents a coastal region versus an inland region. There may be different needs, and these units within the governor's office of GoBiz need to understand that. Our goals for businesses in the inland region of California may be very different than Southern California or the Bay Area, and we need to make sure we understand that. Now, goals and objectives, again, they could be agency-wide or they could be specific to a particular program. So I think GoBiz in general needs to have agency-wide goals and objectives, but then each of the units within need to have program-specific. And then again, statewide versus regional. What do we want to accomplish in Southern California? It may be different than what we want to accomplish in inland. But there may be a foundation that's a common theme throughout, and then there's build-upons. Measures, they need to be quantifiable to the extent you can. Oftentimes when we've looked at strategic plans and we've looked at performance metrics, the goals are vague and then the actual measures are relatively vague as well. We want to improve the economy. Well, how are we going to do that? We want more jobs. We want more businesses. We want businesses to grow, which ends up being more, creating more jobs. Over what time period? One of the things that when we audited the Recovery Act and the millions and millions of dollars that came into California, an element of the Recovery Act was reporting jobs created. And there was a lot of trouble with the initial reporting by all states, including California, because the expectations from the federal government were not clear. What exactly is a created job? And how often do I report that same job? A lot of the reporting, you're reporting the same job every quarter. And that takes me to frequency. How often do you want to collect the data Is it analysis that's done on a quarterly basis, or do you collect the data monthly and then take a step back and look at it quarterly, look at it over the course of a year, look at it over several years? So that's another issue that needs to be determined, not only quantifying, but what's the periodic analysis time frame that needs to be set so that you can do an analysis of performance. Ongoing monitoring is very, very important, and reporting program accomplishments. I think transparency, because the more analysis that's done and the successes that are put out there, then other businesses, other entities are going to understand, wow, this is a really well-functioning unit. This is a place I need to go to get help for my small business so that I can benefit from it as well. And certainly I'm sure you've heard of outputs versus outcomes. Clearly outputs is just basically counting. Okay, we held an outreach and we encountered or had interactions with 2,000 or 100 businesses. But then an outcome is 50 of those businesses actually used our services and were benefited from those services. So there's a distinction between outputs and outcomes. With respect to targets, you need to consistently reassess your target, because oftentimes we find some entities will set their targets and their target is set so low it's easily accomplished. You're not really stretching the agency. That agency is not really pushing to excel. And then sometimes and rarely, but sometimes they may set those targets too high and not really be realistic. But you need to consistently set the target at the best you can, but then reassess and determine whether or not that target needs to change. And that's the periodic revisions. Data collection. This is an issue regardless of whether we're looking at strategic planning or just auditing a particular entity that the legislature has asked us to audit. Data collection, that's critically important to make sure that you identify the specific elements that you want to collect. And how are you going to use those data elements? Are they really meaningful? Are you just collecting data to say you're collecting a pile of data and you don't really understand what that data says? That's why it ties back to your goals and objectives. If our goal is to accomplish, my office to improve government in California. Okay, that's not a real definitive goal. It's an important goal, but then we as an organization go through and say, okay, how are we going to do that? We're going to issue X number of audit reports. We're going to make recommendations to the legislature. We're going to have a return on investment, $10 for every dollar invested in the state auditor's office, and then we go back and we measure how well we're doing. How quickly are we getting our audits done? If we get an audit done, I always tell staff, if we get an audit done a month after the legislature has already enacted the budget or the legislature has already passed a bill, we're too late. So all of that work has gone it's futile. So it's really, really important to make sure that you understand which data elements you should be collected. There may be some that are unique for a particular program. There may be common elements you want to collect. GoBiz may want to collect across all programs. Again, that's the agency-wide. But then within specific programs, there may be very unique characteristics or data that the GoBiz would want to collect to assess that particular program. One issue with data, accuracy and completeness. And again, if you ask small businesses to report a voluminous amount of data, the likelihood is, with all due respect to businesses, that's overwhelming perhaps for a small business, and they're just going to, I need to report this information, I'm just going to get it to the state GoBiz office, and I met my responsibility. But if you narrow the types of data elements they need to report, then the likelihood of accuracy and getting complete data is a little bit higher. I also mentioned, the consistency of the type of data, making sure that you define the elements. Sometimes, especially when we were doing Recovery Act work, the definition of a job created, that was clearly an issue. Some departments in California, for example, if they had an infusion of money through the Recovery Act and they were able to retain some positions at an agency, they called that a job created. Well, it's not really a job created, but it was a job that was saved. So there really needs to be a clear definition for each of the data elements so that everyone understands what they're reporting and that you're confident that the information that's reported is consistent. And then when you're measuring that program in various regions of the state or you're measuring that program over time, you have consistent analysis and you're using consistent data. And then the last thing, again, is the frequency of data collection. How often do you need to collect the data? How often does that data need to be analyzed? You may have monthly reporting, but then decide quarterly is enough, or maybe quarterly is too frequent. You need to give a program a certain amount of time to really evolve and then take a look back. But having consistent data and clear definitions allows you to measure over time so that you can see improvement in a particular program within the state. So those are the key things that we actually look at with respect to performance auditing, performance metrics, outcomes, outputs, those sorts of things. So it's a brief presentation, but if you have any questions or any other information you're interested in, I'd be happy to share that.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm going to ask that the next speaker come up, and then we will take all three of you and open it up for any questions or comments from the members on the committee. So thank you again. Our second speaker is Dr. Ellen Harpel, Executive Director of Smart Incentives. She is the founder of Smart Incentives, which helps communities make decisions throughout the economic development incentives process by addressing effective incentive use, competitive analysis, and state and local incentive policies and assessments of incentive management and evaluation. She's also the Senior Research Fellow with the Center for Regional Economic Competitiveness and affiliate with the Center for Regional Analysis at George Mason University. So welcome, Doctor.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. I'm really very pleased to be here. And I just want to say a few more words about my background. I am president also of Business Development Advisors, which is an economic development and market intelligence consulting firm started in 1999. Smart Incentives was launched about 3 years ago, focused on those very topics, because we've seen incentives become, whether we like it or not, a higher profile and bigger part of how at least economic development work is perceived now. But we found that there was...
pull the microphone, just thank you.
But we also found that there was a lack of the issues that we've been hearing about so far this morning, data analysis and a focus on transparency and accountability. And so we're very interested in solving some of the hard problems that are out there that have kept us from answering the questions that we want to have answered about incentive use particularly. But all of this is done in the context of a bigger picture look at economic development. So my remarks today draw on the work that my partners and I have done over the years with state and local economic development groups across the country, as well as lessons learned from a project called the Business Incentives Initiative, which was conducted by the Pew Charitable Trust and the Center for Regional Economic Competitiveness. And I participated in this effort as a member of the Center for Regional Economic Competitiveness team. The purpose of this initiative was to identify effective ways to manage and assess incentive policies and practices focused on data collection and management, analysis of data for decision-making, and improving accountability and transparency. So in other words, how to evaluate whether and which incentive programs work. So this morning, in considering methods for evaluating economic development activities, including but not limited to incentives, I want to emphasize 5 features that are really important for program evaluation and organizational oversight. And many of the themes that I'll talk about are, very consistent with what you just heard about, but I hope amplified and applied specifically to the unique economic development environment. First, as you heard, it's really important to start with the big picture, being clear on organizational goals and program objectives, because this will determine what you want to measure. It was very interesting. The Business Incentives Initiative was really designed in a lot of ways to address some of the technical challenges associated with data, definitions and data collection and management. But what we found was one of the real challenges is that many economic development organizations and incentive programs operate, as you heard, under very vague guidance. That doesn't make it easy to understand what the overall mission is and makes it very difficult to evaluate. To quote one of the reports from this effort, goals too frequently either don't exist, are too vague, or are obsolete. But creating goal statements for economic development can really be difficult because there's often a perception, given the very words themselves, economic development, that this can be anything to anyone. And it can be very difficult to both keep expectations realistic about what an economic development organization can accomplish and what should be done, what should be the focus of the organization or individual programs. It can be really hard to remember that even at the entire organizational level, at a state level, you're still talking perhaps dozens of employees and maybe, for a very big program, tens of millions of dollars that aren't able, probably in the near term, to move something as large as a state economy or a regional economy. So it's really important to keep expectations realistic about what an economic development group can possibly achieve with the resources at its disposal. That's not to say we can't do many different things, obviously, and we're in this because we want to make our communities and the places where we live better places to live and work. So some questions to ask when you're starting to think about, well, what should our organizational and programmatic goals be? What are your values and principles? What are you trying to achieve? What does success look like? And this will, of course, vary by state and location. But I have a few examples to share with you from our work. Nebraska, as part of its evaluation, crafted a goal statement that emphasized the following: strengthening the state's economy by attracting and expanding businesses, increasing employment and high-quality jobs, revitalizing rural and other distressed areas of the state, and diversifying the state's economy. So those are very broad statements, and not all of them are equally easy to measure, but it definitely gives them some markers to aim for as they adjust their portfolio of programs and evaluate their activities. Another example comes from Tennessee, from their Economic and Community Development Department, which is a government agency. They have a variety of goals, but the one that has always stood out to me as critical to their efforts is their emphasis on expanding opportunities throughout the state. In Tennessee, as in many other places, investment tends to flow towards the major cities, and it's a critical part of what they do as an economic development agency to try to create opportunities for other parts of their state. Wisconsin recently rearticulated its mission as advancing and maximizing opportunities for businesses, communities, and people to thrive in a globally competitive economy. In this case, what they were trying to emphasize was broad-based competitiveness in this state as their economy changes. They're a very manufacturing-oriented state, and a lot of manufacturing trends are not promising. So refocusing on competitiveness is a critical part of what they need to do as an economic development agency. They also wanted to de-emphasize transactions with individual businesses and remind everyone that they had a broader mission of economic and community development that they were trying to achieve. At the program level as well, more states are working to make sure that programs include a goal or a performance statement to explain the purpose and expectations for outcomes in order to facilitate evaluation. And I'll give you two examples of why this is important. Maryland and Massachusetts each have a biotech or life sciences tax incentive program. And so on the surface of it, if you just looked at these programs, you would assume that they were similar. But they have very different purposes in mind, and therefore the expectations for outcomes are very different. In Maryland, its objective is to assist the state's early-stage life sciences companies to raise funding. That is its objective, and that's how it's evaluated. In Massachusetts, the similar-sounding program has a mission of incentivizing life sciences companies to create new long-term jobs in Massachusetts. So that shows how important at the programmatic level these goal statements are. The second theme is to select metrics for evaluation carefully, thinking about what can be measured. As you heard already, this is challenging. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, but there are definitely ways to approach it in an economic development context that makes sense. And there are two parts to this theme. First, clearly, metrics should be connected to the goals and strategies. This again sounds easy, but it's not. For example, as we've already talked about the difficulty of measuring and counting jobs, which should be one of the easier things one would think to do. Most economic development groups do try to measure jobs and investment, but it becomes very challenging very quickly to define a job. What's a new job? What's a full-time job? Does every agency and program define full-time job the same way? Do you count part-time jobs or contract employment? When do you count them, and compared to what baseline? So these are just a few of the challenges. Jobs, of course, though, are by no means the only focus of most economic development programs. And it can be a challenge to identify good metrics for some of the goals that we just heard about: economic diversification, revitalization of distressed communities, job quality, sustainability, equity. So in choosing metrics, it's important to keep these overarching goals in mind, but it's also important to be realistic. For example, many economic development groups right now are really trying to focus their efforts on income inequality. But this is a national, even a global challenge, and it is not reasonable to expect one economic development group to reverse this trend in a state or a region or even a single community. So we want to choose metrics that capture the concept, but don't pin the entire economic outcome on a single program or department. The second part of selecting metrics for economic development evaluation is to be aware of other data challenges when selecting these metrics. Things like availability of data, the cost of obtaining the data validity, quality, and time frame, by which I mean how well the data you capture align with the program time frame. Some states have found that they need to take steps to enable data sharing among state agencies to facilitate evaluation and to use state records to validate data received from companies. This is also something that doesn't just happen on its own, and it sounds like it should be easy, but it is not. It often requires special steps, agreements to use what is considered confidential data, whether it's about individuals in the workforce or tax records to validate the data that you want to and to understand if your programs are working as well as you'd like them to do. This is not without effort and without cost. We should also recognize that metrics will not be perfect. They won't capture everything we could possibly want to know, but we want enough good information, and it's possible to obtain enough good information to assess whether our efforts are moving us in the direction that we want to go. I also want to give you an example of how this process of connecting metrics to strategies while selecting manageable measurements played out with one state that that participated in the Business Incentives Initiative, because I think it's helpful to think through how you can go through the process. So this state was trying to choose appropriate metrics for its non-tax incentive and business financing programs and other economic development services. And these were programs that were designed to support economic development but weren't really geared towards helping businesses or to influence location decisions. And they knew that job counts and investment, which were the main metrics that they were asked as an economic development organization to consider, weren't really appropriate for a lot of these programs, but they weren't sure what other measures were appropriate to use. So we talked about it with them, and of these variety of programs and services, we decided to focus on their community development financing programs. Now, their state community development objectives were pretty clear. It was on their website and very concisely stated. They wanted to focus on vibrant and sustainable places that could attract and retain talent and attract businesses. Now, within this category of community development finance, they had three main programs. The program goals varied quite a bit among these three programs, as did the metrics. But they included things like accelerating private investment in communities, redeveloping properties, assisting businesses, helping low and moderate income residents, and supporting the entrepreneurial environment. So you can see they weren't perfectly aligned with each other, but that's what they had to work with. This happens a lot because a lot of programs are legacy programs. They come from another time and place with their own rules and standards, and sometimes they evolve over time and sometimes they don't. So the challenge was that the program goals and certainly the existing metrics were not aligned as well as we would have liked with the overarching mission, and several of the metrics focused on what was spent but not what was accomplished. And many of the bigger picture metrics that they were hoping to get at, reduction in crime and poverty, for example, were really unlikely to be affected by these programs. A few $100,000 in downtown revitalization isn't going to move the needle on some of these bigger picture socioeconomic issues. So our approach was to research a set of potential metrics from a variety of sources, not just the economic development field, and we tried to do a fairly broad literature review. And we rated them roughly by data availability, comparability, because we wanted them to be able to conduct comparisons among like programs or programs with similar goals, and connection to objectives and program goals. But that also had a link to things like the well-being of the residents, had a quality aspect, and an appropriate time frame. So we basically created this big matrix of goals and data quality indicators. And we settled on a set that we thought were both manageable, doable, and indicated whether these financing programs were generating the intended benefits. So the recommendations that we made at the end of the day were that in communities or locations where these programs were active, they would look at things like changes in property values or taxable value of properties tracked over time, employment density and residential density, number of new businesses or number of business establishments over time. We looked at community facilities because this is one of the a key part of a lot of community development focuses is providing better access to services to people in certain communities, so education, training, healthcare. And then dollar value and description of specific infrastructure improvements. So these weren't the perfect measures. None of the metrics checked all of the boxes, but they definitely helped the Economic Development Organization understand better and report on what they were accomplishing through these programs. Three more features that I'd like to mention pretty quickly. Number 3 is the importance of communicating findings from these evaluations. We're engaged in economic development because we care deeply about the communities where we live, and we want to make them better places to live, work, and do business. So it's really important to communicate what we're doing and why we're doing it to people, that in our own communities, and evaluations can help tell this story. It's not always an easy story to tell, however, especially when you get in the minutia of a lot of data and program evaluation details. But I just want to share a few thoughts on sharing evaluation information with different audiences. One is to keep in mind that different audiences have different needs. People, for example, in this room will want a lot of detail, and they'll ask a lot of questions, and they'll really want to kind of dig into the nitty-gritty of what's going on with programs and the evaluations. But most people will just want kind of the one-pager or maybe even the one sentence, and it's important to be able to summarize all of this information for these different audiences. And part of that is making information available in multiple formats. We've also found that presenting information in more user-friendly formats, not just a giant PDF or a spreadsheet, is awfully valuable. And using maybe infographics or other ways to tell the story will help people absorb the complicated message that can come out of these kinds of program evaluations. A related point is the importance of offering some context and storytelling. So we're not advocating reporting by anecdote, but explaining why these programs are so valuable. So it's not just a number in a spreadsheet, but here's what it's really accomplished in your community. A fourth theme is to approach evaluation with a collaborative attitude, a mindset of improvement, not punishment. This is certainly true for getting a good evaluation completed, but it's more important, obviously, for using the insights gained from the evaluation. And so, at the state level, you are all in this together. Everyone's on Team California. And so you're striving to make economic development work well. And so a collaborative attitude where the objective is to improve how you do this is the end game. Indiana has provided a really good example of this collaborative approach. They recently passed legislation that requires an evaluation of each of their tax incentives. This is not just for economic development, but all of their tax incentives every 5 years. Nonpartisan legislative staff, in this case, the Office of Fiscal and Management Analysis and their Legislative Services Agency, is responsible for the evaluations, and a legislative commission oversees the evaluations and makes recommendations. But what's most noteworthy about it is that the process is intended to be collaborative, not punitive, and the objective is to better align tax incentive use with the intended policy objectives. And the level of trust and respect among all the parties involved in these evaluations has really been impressive and has enabled very high-quality evaluations. We really can't emphasize enough how important this collaborative approach to evaluation is to a successful evaluation. And then finally, the fifth theme is the importance of devoting some resources to the effort. This is not something that can be done in someone's spare time. You need to have a good team. It tends to have to be a multidisciplinary, often a cross-agency team, and give them some time because this is not easy to do for many of the reasons that we have already discussed today. And then finally, I'll just conclude by saying, as I think our community development financing example demonstrated, don't expect perfection. And it's not worth waiting to do the evaluation until you feel like you've gotten everything down perfectly. You'll always be evolving and improving over time. But I think you can advance the objective of conducting high-quality evaluations to improve decision-making and program design and implementation with much of the information that we have and that we've discussed today.